Section 1. The show that became a cultural flashpoint. Welcome back. Get comfortable. Settle in. Whether you've got your blanket pulled up to your chin, headphones in, lights low, this one is going to take you all the way through the night. We're talking about a show that has been in the news more times than most politicians. A cartoon that's been banned by foreign governments, taken to court by Hollywood legends, pulled from streaming services within hours of breaking news events, and mourned by millions when a fictional talking dog met his end on a Sunday evening in November. This is the full story of every time Family Guy made it to the actual news. Not just the internet chatter, not just the fan forums, but the kind of news that ends up on CNN, in federal courtrooms, on the floor of foreign legislatures, and trending at the top of every social media platform on Earth. Family Guy debuted on January 31st, 1999, right after Super Bowl 33. If you know anything about television, you know that the post-Super Bowl slot is the single most watched programming window in the entire American broadcast year. Tens of millions of people tuned in to watch the game, stayed in their seats when it ended, and were introduced to the Griffin family for the very first time. That premiere episode, titled Death Has a Shadow, was watched by roughly 22 million people. For a brand new animated show from a 25-year-old creator named Seth MacFarlane, a kid fresh out of the Rhode Island School of Design who had been drawing cartoons for Hanna-Barbera just a couple of years earlier, that number was almost incomprehensible. He had pitched the show to Fox in May of 1998 using a 7-minute hand-drawn pilot he had animated almost entirely at home, and now here he was, debuting to an audience the size of a small country. The premise was deceptively simple. A working-class family in a fictional town in Rhode Island. Dad was overweight, not particularly sharp, beloved in the way that a golden retriever is beloved. Loyal, enthusiastic, inclined to cause property damage. Mom was the anchor, the competent one, the person quietly holding the whole enterprise together while pretending to find her husband's disasters charming. There were kids who were recognizable, a baby who was secretly a genius and a would-be murderer, and a dog who was the most intellectually developed person in any room he entered. That dog could talk, had a taste for dry martinis and failed literary ambitions, and served as the moral compass of the show. Which, given that the show had very little moral center, meant Brian Griffin had a lot of work to do. From the beginning, the show had a relationship with controversy that wasn't accidental. Seth MacFarlane described Family Guy as a kind of modern vaudeville, a format built on rapid-fire references, cultural riffs, and a willingness to go somewhere that network television typically wouldn't. The humor was pointed. The cutaway gags interrupted the main story to deliver jokes that could be mean, absurd, politically loaded, or just surreally strange. The characters had an edge to them that distinguished the show from the wholesome American family comedies that had dominated primetime television for decades. This was not the Brady Bunch. This was not even The Simpsons, which by the late 90s had mellowed considerably from its own early years of pushing buttons. Family Guy pushed buttons with something that felt almost like enthusiasm. The characters made fun of AIDS, of religion, of racial stereotypes, of politicians, of celebrities, of tragedy, of the very idea that there were limits to what a cartoon could say at 8 o'clock on a Sunday night. Within the first 2 seasons, the Parents Television Council, a conservative watchdog organization that existed essentially to file complaints with the Federal Communications Commission, had identified the show as one of the most dangerous programs on American television. They launched letter-writing campaigns to Fox's advertisers. They published guides naming Family Guy the worst show on primetime television. They filed formal FCC complaints. They generated enough institutional outrage to give the show a kind of permanent notoriety that most creators would either cringe at or quietly treasure. MacFarlane famously did not cringe. He treasured it. He would later describe getting hate mail from the Parents Television Council as being like getting hate mail from Hitler, which is a sentence that tells you everything you need to know about the specific kind of chaos energy the man was operating with. The first cancellation came in 2002. Fox had been shuffling the show around the schedule without warning, dropping it into time slots where it had to compete with established blockbusters like Friends and Survivor. The audience that had showed up for the post-Super Bowl premiere couldn't find the show from one week to the next. Ratings fell. Fox pulled the plug, and it looked like that was the end of the Griffin family. But something happened that nobody in the television industry had seen at that scale before. Cartoon Network's Adult Swim block bought the rights to air reruns for almost nothing, because nobody thought the show was worth much. They put it on the air in April of 2003, and it became the highest-rated program on the block almost immediately. The reruns pulled in huge numbers. The DVD sets sold hundreds of thousands of copies. A fan base that had been scattered and frustrated found each other, and the noise they made was loud enough to reach Fox's boardrooms. By 2004, Fox had done something networks almost never do. They ordered new episodes of a canceled show. Family Guy was coming back, and when it returned in 2005 for its fourth season, it came back to an audience that had spent 3 years proving just how much they cared about it. The ratings for the revival were enormous. The show was placed as the centerpiece of Fox's animation domination Sunday night block. Seth MacFarlane had not just survived cancellation, he had turned it into legend. But the version of the show that came back was already slightly different from the one that left. 3 years of dormancy had scattered the original writing staff. New writers had different ideas about how far was too far. The tone began to shift in ways that were subtle at first. The cutaway gags that had always been a feature became more dominant, longer, more disconnected from the main story. Characters began to drift from who they had been. And the show's relationship with controversy, already a foundational part of its identity, became more intense, more frequent, and occasionally more genuinely newsworthy in ways that extended far beyond television. Critics typing angry reviews. Over the 26 years since that Super Bowl premiere, Family Guy has been the subject of federal indecency proceedings. It has been banned by a foreign government at the direction of a sitting head of state. It has been sued for millions of dollars by some of the most famous names in American entertainment. It has been pulled from streaming platforms within hours of real-world tragedies because of its content. It has generated petition drives with over 100,000 signatures. It has sparked diplomatic tensions. It has produced the only episode in American animated television history that Fox refused to broadcast not once but permanently. A distinction that stands even today, more than 15 years after the episode was produced. And it has been at the center of some of the most heated cultural debates of the last 3 decades about what comedy is allowed to say, who it's allowed to say it about, and whether a cartoon has the same responsibilities to its audience that a news broadcast does. This is the story of all of that. Every headline, every lawsuit, every congressional criticism, every banned episode, every trending hashtag. Told slowly, thoroughly the way it deserves to be told. Because the story of Family Guy's relationship with the news is in a lot of ways the story of where the lines are in American culture, and what happens to a show that keeps finding those lines, stepping over them, and daring anyone to do something about it. If you're just getting comfortable, drop a comment right now with where you are in the world and what time it is. I love knowing that this is keeping someone company through the night somewhere, whether you're in a bedroom in Ohio or a flat in Manchester at 3 in the morning. Let me know you're out there. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. We do this slow, detailed storytelling regularly, and there's a lot more coming. Section 2. The Early Battles. Fought with the FCC and the first years of war. Before Family Guy ever became the kind of show that made international headlines, it was already deep in a war with one of the most powerful lobbying groups in American broadcasting. That group was the Parents Television Council, and their hatred of Family Guy was not casual or occasional. It was sustained, organized, and relentless in a way that made the show something of a test case for the limits of broadcast television in the late 90s and early 2000s. To understand how significant this battle was, you have to understand what the PTC actually was and how it operated. Founded in 1995 by L. Brent Bozell, the organization built itself as a watchdog for content on broadcast television, the kind of television that, unlike cable, operates on public airwaves that are technically licensed by the federal government. That license comes with the theoretical condition that broadcasters won't air content that's obscene, indecent, or profane during hours when children might be watching. The FCC is the government body responsible for enforcing those rules, but FCC enforcement requires complaints from the public. So the PTC's model was simple and effective. They monitored television programming, identified content they found objectionable, and mobilized their membership, which they claimed reached over 1.3 million people at peak, to file formal FCC complaints in large enough numbers to force the agency to investigate. This model had worked before. When Janet Jackson's wardrobe malfunction during the 2004 Super Bowl halftime show became the most complained about moment in television history, the PTC was heavily involved in generating those complaints. CBS faced a $550,000 fine, which was eventually overturned on appeal. But the event had chilled what broadcasters were willing to do on live television. The PTC had demonstrated that it could make noise loud enough to move regulatory bodies, and that noise had real financial consequences for networks. Family Guy was on the PTC's radar from the moment it premiered. The very first season included the kind of content the organization was designed to fight. Crude humor about sex, drugs, violence, bodily functions, and religion, delivered at 8 o'clock on Sunday nights on the Fox broadcast network. The PTC made it a target. In May of 2000, they launched a coordinated letter-writing campaign to Fox calling for the show's cancellation. They sent emails to Fox's advertisers directly, arguing that companies whose products were marketed to children were funding content that was deeply inappropriate for that audience. The argument had some surface logic. Family Guy aired at 8 in the evening, which is technically within what broadcasters call the family viewing hour, a period when networks are supposed to exercise extra caution about content. And the animated format meant that the show's audience included children who might stumble onto it expecting something more benign. Fox resisted the pressure that first time. The network stood behind the show, and the PTC's campaign didn't succeed in canceling it immediately. But it was the opening move in what would become a decade-long conflict that generated hundreds of thousands of federal complaints and turned Family Guy into the most complained about show in American television history. The first formal FCC complaint related to Family Guy came in January of 2005, following a rebroadcast of an episode called "And the Wiener Is." The complaint was filed after the PTC objected to the episode's extended focus on the word penis and various euphemisms for it. The FCC reviewed the complaint and denied it. The agency's decision was notable for its careful legal reasoning. The FCC found that because the episode lacked what they termed graphic descriptions or depictions of any sexual organ, along with what they described as any shocking, pandering, or titillating effect, the episode was not legally obscene under the broadcast indecency standard. That standard, set by the Supreme Court in its landmark FCC versus Pacifica decision in 1978, defined indecent content as material that depicts or describes sexual or excretory activities in a patently offensive way, as measured by contemporary community standards for broadcast media. The FCC found that Family Guy's approach, while crude, didn't cross that legal line. The PTC was unmoved by the FCC's reasoning. They continued filing complaints. By the show's 6th and 7th seasons, they had named Family Guy the worst show of the week on at least 40 separate occasions, with individual episodes being singled out for content ranging from animated nudity and explicit sexual references to extended violence, and, most controversially, jokes about AIDS. That last one generated its own wave of backlash from a very different direction than the PTC. In 2005, shortly after the show returned from cancellation, an episode included a musical number about AIDS. The show had always had a pattern of turning dark subject matter into song. There was something both audacious and unexpectedly effective about the format, because putting words about a terrible thing to a jaunty melody creates a kind of cognitive dissonance that the show used for maximum comic effect. But several AIDS advocacy organizations found nothing funny about it at all. AIDS Project Los Angeles and similar groups issued public statements condemning the episode, calling the decision to turn a disease that had killed millions of people worldwide into the subject of a light comedy song irresponsible and disturbing. They argued that the show was contributing to AIDS-related stigma at a time when stigma was still a genuine barrier to testing and treatment. This was not the kind of criticism that came from conservative watchdog groups complaining about indecency. This was criticism from within the communities most directly affected by the disease, and it had a different moral weight. MacFarlane's response to critics in general during this period was characteristically unapologetic. The show was, as he consistently described it, an equal opportunity offender. Nothing was sacred. Everything was a potential subject. And the fact that a joke was about something serious or even tragic didn't put it off limits. If anything, Family Guy operated from the premise that comedy could coexist with darkness, and that the willingness to go there was part of what made the show honest. Whether you agreed with that philosophy or not, it was consistently applied. The PTC, though, was not interested in philosophical arguments about the nature of comedy. They were interested in forcing the FCC to act, and their most significant effort came in 2009. An episode called Family Gay aired on March 8th of that year. The episode's central plot involved Peter getting injected with what the show called the gay gene as part of a medical experiment, temporarily making him homosexual. The episode also included, as the PTC described it in their complaint to the FCC, depictions of an 11-way gay orgy, bestiality, and a scene in which baby Stewie ate a bowl of cereal with horse sperm instead of milk. Those descriptions are accurate to the episode's content, delivered in the flat, matter-of-fact tone that the PTC used in all their communications, which had the strange effect of making the complaints themselves sound more surreal than the show they were complaining about. The PTC launched a mass campaign. They urged their entire membership to file FCC complaints simultaneously. By the time the campaign was finished, they had generated over 188,000 individual complaints to the FCC, a number that was, at the time, one of the largest coordinated complaint campaigns in FCC history for a single episode of a scripted comedy series. 188,000 people sent letters to the federal government about a cartoon. The FCC reviewed the matter. And then, as they had done repeatedly before, they declined to take action. The reason the FCC consistently declined to act against Family Guy, even with hundreds of thousands of complaints in hand, came down to a legal distinction that the PTC found infuriating. The FCC's indecency standard applies to content that is patently offensive by contemporary community standards. The agency's position, implicitly, was that Family Guy's content, however crude, didn't meet that legal bar when viewed in the context of what American audiences had come to expect from animated primetime comedy. The show was on at 9 o'clock in some markets, later in others. It was on a channel that had a track record of mature animated content. Its audience, while including children, primarily consisted of adults who had elected to watch a show with a well-documented history of pushing boundaries. The FCC wasn't going to fine Fox over a joke about horse sperm in a cartoon. This outcome didn't stop the PTC, and it didn't stop MacFarlane from responding to them publicly either. His statement about the organization, that's like getting hate mail from Hitler, they're literally terrible human beings, was made in a 2008 interview with The Advocate magazine and was widely reported as one of the most colorful public escalations of the conflict. It's worth noting the specific venue. The Advocate is the oldest LGBTQ publication in the United States, and MacFarlane was giving the interview largely because the PTC had been vocally critical of the show's depictions of gay characters. His response, delivered to a publication with a specific political identity, was itself a kind of statement about where he stood in the culture war the PTC was trying to wage. MacFarlane also took the conflict into the show itself. An episode called PTV was a direct satirical response to the FCC and the PTC's censorship campaigns. In it, Peter starts his own television network to escape broadcast regulations after the FCC fines him for belching during dinner. The episode included a sequence of increasingly absurd FCC intrusions into everyday life, including the censorship of a sneeze and the beeping out of mundane household sounds. It was one of the clearest examples of the show using its own notoriety as material, turning its regulatory battles into comedy and thereby making its critics part of the act. The FCC, for its part, never managed to actually fine Fox over Family Guy in any of these cases. The PTC's record of success in its direct conflict with the show was essentially zero. But the sustained attention, the parade of complaints, and the organizational effort that went into fighting the show had real indirect effects. Advertisers were occasionally pressured. Some sponsors quietly reduced their Family Guy buys. Microsoft actually pulled its advertising from the show at one point, citing a mismatch between the show's content and what the company wanted to be associated with in connection with a Windows brand campaign. That's a significant advertiser, and the fact that a technology giant felt its brand was incompatible with a primetime cartoon said something about the territory Family Guy had staked out. There's a strange footnote to the whole PTC versus Family Guy saga. It ends, unexpectedly, with a kind of peace. Years after calling the organization Hitler adjacent, Seth MacFarlane eventually met PTC president Tim Winter in person. They sat down together, and by his own account, MacFarlane found the meeting humanizing in a way he hadn't expected. "I was properly humbled," he told the Los Angeles Times. "I figured that I gotta give him a call. You find out that you have a lot more in common than you initially thought." Winter, for his part, said the relationship proved that constructive conversation between people who disagree was possible. And in a genuinely strange twist, the PTC eventually praised MacFarlane's science fiction show The Orville, which ran on Fox and then Hulu for its thoughtful storytelling. The organization that spent 15 years trying to get Family Guy taken off the air ended up complimenting the same man's other work. The PTC itself, as of October 2025, filed for bankruptcy protection. The organization that had been the most persistent institutional opponent of Family Guy, that had generated nearly 200,000 FCC complaints about a single episode, that had published Family Guy as a worst show of the week 40-plus times, filed for Chapter 11 with roughly $92,000 in assets and $285,000 in liabilities. The Burbank nonprofit that had spent decades fighting broadcast indecency went quietly bankrupt. Family Guy is still on the air. Section 3. Stewie, Dark Comedy, and the Limits of What a Baby Can Say. There is something uniquely unsettling about comedy that comes from the wrong place. When Stewie Griffin debuted in 1999, his unsettling quality was precisely the point. He was 1 year old. He was in diapers. He spoke with the measured cadence of a British stage villain and spent his days building laser guns, designing mind control devices, and plotting the murder of his mother. The joke, structurally, was the contrast between the soft pastels of baby childhood and the grand homicidal ambitions housed inside that tiny body. He wanted to take over the world. He wanted Lois dead. He wanted to enslave humanity under his iron-fisted rule, and he articulated these goals with the calm, complete seriousness of a corporate executive presenting a quarterly earnings report. In the first 3 seasons, Stewie generated a specific kind of controversy that was different from the broader FCC battles the show was fighting. Parents groups objected to the character on principle. Here was a children's format, an animated cartoon, featuring a baby whose entire personality was built around murder and world domination. The concern was that this normalized violence for young viewers who might watch the show and absorb its central premise without the satirical framework that adults could apply. The PTC named Stewie specifically in some of their complaints, pointing to scenes in which he tortured people, fired weapons, and discussed his plans to kill his mother in disturbingly casual detail. MacFarlane's consistent position was that Stewie existed in a clearly surreal register that no viewer, child or adult, could reasonably mistake for instruction. A baby who speaks with a mid-Atlantic accent, builds weather control devices in his nursery, and monologues about enslaving all of humanity is not a realistic portrayal of infant psychology. The character was a genre parody, specifically a parody of the classic villain figure from spy movies and comic books, given the maximum possible incongruity by being housed in the body of a toddler. The comedy didn't work unless the audience recognized the gap between form and content, between what Stewie looked like and what he was saying. That gap, MacFarlane argued, was itself the proof that nobody was meant to take it seriously. Whether or not that argument is fully convincing, it's the argument the show made consistently. And Stewie's early seasons generated the specific kind of controversy that dark comedy always generates. Not the kind that ends in FCC hearings or banned episodes, but the kind that shows up in think pieces and moral concern columns in newspapers and magazines. Think pieces in publications with names like Parents Magazine and Family Circle ran pieces about the Stewie phenomenon, asking whether it was appropriate that America's most popular animated character for young viewers was a baby who wanted to commit matricide. These pieces almost always reach the same conclusion. The character was unsettling, the parents should be aware, but ultimately the real question was why children were watching a show clearly marketed to adults in the first place. This question, who was Family Guy's actual audience, was at the center of almost every controversy the show generated. The PTC consistently argued that animated programming attracted child viewers who couldn't be expected to apply adult analytical frameworks to the content they consumed. MacFarlane consistently argued that Family Guy was made for adults, and that whatever children might watch, it was a parenting question, not a programming question. Fox stuck a TV-14 rating on the show, which was technically the network's recommendation that viewers be at least 14 years old. In practice, studies showed that Family Guy was among the most watched shows among children between the ages of 2 and 12. The animated format crossed demographic lines in ways that live-action content didn't. Stewie's specific brand of darkness generated its most significant news coverage when the show, in its 6th season, committed to a 2-part episode that was the culmination of everything the character had been building toward since the pilot. Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie were broadcast in 2007, and they represented the show doing something genuinely bold with its central premise, actually following through on the joke that had been at the heart of the character for 6 years. In the first part, Stewie boards a cruise ship, corners Lois, and apparently shoots her dead. In the second part, Lois turns out to have survived and comes back for revenge, leading to a showdown in which Stewie actually takes over the world, becoming the dictator he had always aspired to be. It was, by any measure, ambitious television. It was dark and funny and carried genuine dramatic weight. The coverage these episodes generated was significant, but it was also complicated by the twist. The entire two-part storyline turned out to be a simulation running inside Stewie's computer. None of it had actually happened. Everything reset. Lois was fine, Stewie was back to scheming, and the world domination that fans had waited 6 years to see was revealed to be not a real event, but a kind of extended video game cutscene. Critics who had praised the episodes for their dramatic commitment felt slightly cheated. The show had gone right up to the edge of actually changing something and then pulled back at the last moment, as it would do repeatedly throughout its run with any development that threatened to permanently alter the status quo. The Stewie controversy reached its most bizarre external moment, not because of anything the character did within the show, but because of what the show's format encouraged audiences to do with him. Family Guy's cutaway-heavy structure made individual clips extremely shareable, and Stewie's moments, his weapons demonstrations, his villain monologues, his deadpan announcements of murderous intention, were among the most circulated clips in the show's early internet life. This meant that children who had never watched a complete episode of Family Guy might encounter Stewie Griffin through a 30-second clip of him explaining how he planned to eliminate his mother. Without the surrounding context of the show's absurdist tone, those clips could read very differently. They looked out of context, like a cartoon baby calmly discussing murder. And there was nothing the show's creators could do about that, because once content enters the viral economy of the early internet, it escapes any frame the creators might have provided. The most significant media story involving Stewie's original character, the evil genius version that defined the first several seasons, was ultimately the story of his disappearance. By season 8 and beyond, the plans to kill Lois had stopped. The world domination schemes had faded. The weapons were still occasionally referenced, but as nostalgia props rather than active storylines. Stewie had become something softer, more emotionally available, more interested in his friendship with Brian and his personal identity than in enslaving civilization. MacFarlane and the writers made this change deliberately, arguing that the original concept had run its course, that they had explored every possible angle of the evil baby premise, and continuing in that direction would have meant repeating themselves. The fan response to this evolution was substantial and sometimes angry. Online discussions about the change idea generated hundreds of forum threads and comment sections full of viewers who felt the show had abandoned its most original creation in favor of something more generic. The specific complaint was that Stewie, in his later years, was still a well-written and often funny character, but that he was no longer unique. There were other emotionally complicated animated characters with complicated inner lives and interesting friendships. There was only one evil baby genius who had built a death ray in his crib and was committed, at the constitutional level of his personality, to destroying the woman who fed him. That character was gone. And while the show never acknowledged this as a loss in any formal or newsworthy sense, the conversation about what had happened to Stewie Griffin continued for years, became a fixture of the show's critical reception, and entered the cultural record as one of the clearest examples of a once distinctive character being made safe. The episodes in which Stewie's character was most clearly defined, those first 3 seasons of scheming, plotting, and gleefully dark humor about maternal homicide, were the episodes that made him the most recognizable animated character of his generation. That recognition came partly from the merchandise, the Halloween costumes, the quotes on t-shirts. And it came partly from the specific discomfort the character generated, the way he made audiences unsettled and amused simultaneously. The news coverage Stewie attracted in his prime was negative, largely. The PTC hated him. Parenting advocates cited him as an example of what was wrong with modern television. Editorialists used him as shorthand for the show's willingness to make darkness funny. What none of that coverage quite captured was the thing that made Stewie genuinely interesting. The way the character used absurdism to explore something real about infancy and dependency and the rage of the powerless. Stewie's plans to kill Lois were simultaneously completely ridiculous and completely understandable. Every baby is, in the most literal biological sense, entirely at the mercy of the person who feeds and cares for them. Every baby experiences the world primarily through the prism of that relationship. And every parent occasionally notices something in their infant's expression that is not quite the blank innocence they expected. Stewie was that something, given a British accent, a time machine, and a ray gun. The news coverage that called the character offensive or dangerous mostly missed that. But the 20 million people who tuned in every week caught it immediately. Section 4. The episode Fox banned. Abortion, advertisers, and the one story too hot to tell. On September 28, 2010, Family Guy released a DVD. This was not particularly unusual. The show had been releasing season DVD sets regularly since the revival, and they had always done solid business. But this specific DVD was different from any other in the show's history, because the main feature on it was an episode of Family Guy that had never aired on American television. It had never aired on Cartoon Network. It had never appeared on any broadcast or cable channel in the United States. Fox had produced it, reviewed it, and made the deliberate decision not to show it to the American public. That episode was titled Partial Terms of Endearment, and it was about abortion. To this day, and this is worth saying clearly, because it's genuinely unusual, Partial Terms of Endearment has never aired on American television. It premiered in the United Kingdom on BBC Three on June 20th, 2010. It has been released on DVD and was eventually made available for purchase through Amazon in a Family Guy specials package. But Fox has never broadcast it. Adult Swim declined to air it upon Fox's explicit request, and neither Disney Plus, Hulu, nor any other major American streaming platform has included it in their Family Guy libraries. Partial Terms of Endearment is, 15 years after its production, the only episode in the history of Family Guy to be comprehensively banned from the American broadcast landscape. The episode was written by Danny Smith and directed by Joseph Lee. Its premise: Lois runs into an old college friend named Naomi who asks her to serve as a surrogate mother. After some resistance from Peter and some genuine reflection from Lois, she agrees. She undergoes in vitro fertilization and becomes pregnant. Then Naomi and her husband are killed in a car accident. And Lois, suddenly carrying a child for parents who no longer exist, has to decide what to do next. The options the episode considers with genuine seriousness are to carry the pregnancy to term and put the baby up for adoption, or to have an abortion. Peter, initially ambivalent, watches an anti-abortion video put together by activists and becomes passionately opposed to ending the pregnancy. Lois, after genuine deliberation, ultimately chooses to have the abortion. The show, in other words, made a choice. It didn't split the difference. It didn't present a false balance in which the pro-choice and pro-life perspectives were weighted equally and the audience was left to decide. Lois Griffin had an abortion. The episode concluded with that choice made and affirmed. And Fox, when they reviewed the finished product, decided that was a choice they were not willing to broadcast. Kevin Riley, who was the president of Fox Entertainment at the time, was unusually candid about the decision in statements to the press. He did not say the episode was badly made. He did not say the content was obscene or indecent in the FCC's legal sense. He said specifically, it's an extremely fragile subject matter at an extremely fragile economic time. Of all the issues, this is the one that seems to be the most of a hot button. It felt like it could cause trouble, and it was just not worth it. That last phrase, not worth it, is the most revealing. This was not a moral objection. This was a financial calculation. Fox had determined that the advertiser fallout from airing an episode in which a main character had an abortion would cost more than the episode was worth. The content, Riley acknowledged, had been handled well. The episode was not deficient in quality. It was simply too politically charged to survive contact with the American advertising market. This decision itself became news. The story of the banned abortion episode was covered by the Associated Press, by the New York Times, by the Los Angeles Times, by Entertainment Weekly, and by dozens of other outlets. The coverage largely framed Fox's decision as an act of corporate self-censorship driven by fear of advertiser reaction, which is exactly what it was, and Fox didn't really dispute it. Seth MacFarlane made clear he disagreed with the decision. He had expected Fox to eventually air the episode, as they had eventually aired episodes that they had initially pulled for other reasons. Most of the time, these things turn out to be nothing, he said in an interview at the time, suggesting he believed the advertiser concerns were overblown and that the episode would find its way to American audiences through normal channels. It never did. MacFarlane's confidence that Fox would eventually reverse course turned out to be wrong, at least in terms of the broadcast and streaming landscape. 15 years later, you can buy the episode on Amazon. You cannot watch it on any service where you currently watch Family Guy because Disney, which now owns the Family Guy library through its acquisition of 20th Century Fox, has chosen to continue Fox's original policy of not making the episode widely available in American streaming contexts. What made this particularly striking was the comparison to other content the show had aired without issue. Partial Terms of Endearment had been reviewed by critics who got early access and praised it for the quality of its handling of a difficult subject. Fraser Moore of the Associated Press described it as a devilish burlesque and a wickedly astute examination of the current abortion clash. Dave Itzkoff of the New York Times called it typical of that audacious Fox animated comedy, teeming with rapid-fire jokes while engaging seriously with its themes. The episode had made audible gasps when the script was read aloud to a live theater audience, but the gasps were the gasps that good comedy about uncomfortable subjects generates, not the gasps of simple offense. The consensus among people who had actually seen it was that the episode was no more extreme in its humor than many Family Guy episodes that had aired without incident. The only thing that distinguished it was the subject matter and the side it ultimately took on that subject matter. The episode had featured guest voices from Will Wheaton, Julia Sweeney, Gary Beach, and others. It marked the last episode presented in the 4:3 aspect ratio before the show switched to widescreen. It was, in production terms, a completely normal episode that happened to end with a decision that Fox's advertising department couldn't afford. The story continued to generate coverage every few years whenever the abortion debate re-entered the national conversation with particular intensity, because the fact of this episode's existence and its continued non-availability functioned as a cultural data point about what network television would and wouldn't say and why. When the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision eliminated federal abortion rights in June of 2022, media outlets returned to the story of Partial Terms of Endearment as context for how the entertainment industry had long treated the subject. A cartoon that had freely depicted drug use, violence, sexual content of almost every variety, and hours of material that the Parents Television Council had spent 15 years trying to get off the air, had been quietly shelved because it took a position on abortion. The subject that could not be touched was not the one anyone would have predicted. It was not the violence, not the sexual content, not the racial humor. It was the moment a female character made a reproductive choice, and the show affirmed it. There was among Family Guy fans who know about it, a kind of reverence for Partial Terms of Endearment that is inseparable from its unavailability. The forbidden episode. The one they wouldn't show you. The idea of it, and what the refusal to show it reveals about who actually controls what gets said on American television has become more culturally significant than the episode itself probably would have been if Fox had just aired it on a Sunday night in 2010 and moved on. Section 5. Venezuela, a head of state, and the episode that banned a country. In September of 2009, a sitting head of state banned a cartoon dog. This is a sentence that requires some unpacking, but it is accurate. The cartoon dog was Brian Griffin. The head of state was Hugo Chavez, the president of Venezuela. And the episode that prompted the ban was 420, which aired in the United States on April 19, 2009, and featured Brian leading a campaign to legalize marijuana in the fictional Rhode Island town where the Griffins lived. To be precise about the mechanism, it was Venezuela's Interior and Justice Minister, Tarek El Aissami, who issued the formal warning. El Aissami publicly criticized the episode in late September of 2009, specifically citing a musical number called A Bag of Weed, in which Brian and Stewie performed an enthusiastic production number extolling the virtues of cannabis to the tune of a classic show tune. El Aissami called the episode an example of how American media promoted marijuana consumption and served as propaganda for the legalization of drugs. He announced that Venezuelan cable stations that continued to air Family Guy would face financial sanctions. Within days, private broadcasters had pulled the show from their schedules to avoid the fines. Family Guy was effectively banned across Venezuela. The Chavez government had a context for this action that extended beyond the specific episode. Venezuela was, in 2009, in the middle of a sustained government effort to restrict foreign media content that the administration viewed as culturally subversive or ideologically problematic. The Simpsons had been banned from Venezuelan children's programming hours the previous year, replaced by a Venezuelan cartoon, because the government decided the show was inappropriate for the morning slot it had occupied. A congressional report from the United States around the same time had highlighted a significant increase in cocaine trafficking through Venezuela, attributed partly to police corruption and a failure to cooperate with American anti-narcotics agencies. Venezuela, in the government's telling, resented the report, and an American cartoon in which characters cheerfully sang about the joys of marijuana legalization looked to El Aissami like exactly the kind of cultural provocation he was tasked with addressing. The international coverage of the Venezuelan ban was extensive and had a tone that ranged from amused to bemused. The idea that a South American government had dispatched its justice minister to formally identify Brian Griffin as a threat to national drug policy was, from an American media perspective, genuinely funny in the way that only real events can be funny. Foreign Policy magazine ran a piece headlined, "How is Family Guy a threat to the Bolivarian Revolution?" The comedy of the episode's title being the international incident that prompted a government ban was not lost on anyone. It was episode 420, aired on April 19th, one day before the informal cannabis culture holiday on April 20th, and both the number and the timing were entirely intentional. Seth MacFarlane, for his part, did not publicly respond to the Venezuelan ban with any apparent concern. The show had been drawing advertiser complaints and FCC filings for years at this point, and a foreign government deciding the episode promoted drug use was, from the production's perspective, just another entry in a long list of institutions that didn't find the show as funny as its audience did. High Times magazine, which occupied a very different position in the cultural landscape from the Venezuelan government, awarded Brian Griffin the Stoner of the Year award in 2009, making him the first animated character to receive the honor. The same episode that prompted a national ban in Venezuela won its protagonist a counterculture trophy in the United States. The 420 episode was also notable for what it did within the show. Brian's campaign to legalize marijuana in the fictional town where the Griffins lived was eventually successful. Mayor Adam West signs the bill, and the entire population begins using cannabis with the enthusiasm of people discovering a new recreational activity for the first time. The episode then complicates its own apparent message. Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's wealthy father, begins losing money in the lumber industry because hemp production is now providing a cheap alternative for paper. He bribes Peter to mount an anti-marijuana counter-campaign, eventually persuading Brian to join the opposition in exchange for publishing his novel. Brian sacrifices his convictions for the promise of literary success. The drug is rebanned, and then his novel, when it's published, is universally panned and doesn't sell a single copy. The episode's actual moral, embedded under the pro-legalization surface, is a story about selling out your principles for something that turns out to be worthless. The Venezuelan government, in banning the episode, read it as straightforward pro-drug propaganda. American critics read it as complicated. Viewers mostly remembered the song, and the ban, reported internationally, added another layer of notoriety to a show that had been accumulating notoriety since its first episode. There's a secondary layer to the 420 story that's worth noting, because it illustrates how the show's content could interact with real events in ways that were purely coincidental, but carried real weight. The episode featured a cutaway gag in which Peter was shown running over competitors at the Boston Marathon in his car. This gag, contained entirely within the show's absurdist universe and clearly presented as cartoon comedy, would become relevant again 4 years later in circumstances that had nothing to do with Venezuela or marijuana policy. On April 15, 2013, 2 pressure cooker bombs were detonated near the finish line of the Boston Marathon. 3 people were killed, hundreds were injured. It was the worst terrorist attack on American soil since September 11, 2001. Within hours of the bombing, someone edited together 2 unrelated clips from 420 to create a fake video that appeared to show Peter Griffin setting off explosives at the Boston Marathon. The edited clip went viral almost immediately. It was circulated by conspiracy theorists, most prominently by Alex Jones on his InfoWars website, as evidence that the show had somehow predicted or even inspired the attack. The claim was false in every meaningful way. The 2 clips had nothing to do with each other in the actual episode, were from completely different storylines, and had been filmed and aired over a month before the bombing. But in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event, the fake video spread faster than the truth. Fox acted within hours. The network pulled Turban Cowboy, a different episode from a different season that contained the Boston Marathon sequence in its original context, from its streaming platforms and from Hulu. Seth MacFarlane issued a statement calling the edited clip abhorrent and expressing sympathy for everyone affected by the bombing. YouTube marked the circulating clips as potentially offensive. The network issued a statement saying it had no immediate plans to rebroadcast the pulled episode. The edited video, which had turned a cutaway gag from a comedy show into an apparent preview of a terrorist attack, was one of the earliest significant examples of what would later be called deepfake adjacent disinformation. Not a technological manipulation, but an editing manipulation that created a false context for real footage with real consequences. Turban Cowboy itself was a different controversy, and we'll come to it in detail in a later section. But the 2013 incident connected 2 separate controversies and illustrated something important about the relationship between Family Guy's content and the real world. The show's habit of depicting extreme events as throwaway jokes created a library of images, plane crashes, explosions, suns, mass casualties that could be repurposed by bad actors in ways the show's creators had absolutely no control over. The fake clip about the Boston Marathon bombing was not the show's fault, but it was made possible by the show's aesthetic, by its willingness to depict terrible things in 30-second cutaway gags designed to get a quick laugh and be forgotten. Section 6, Real People, Real Lawsuits, and the Celebrities Who Went to Court. Carol Burnett is one of the most beloved figures in American entertainment history. Her television variety show ran for 11 seasons from 1967 to 1978 and is remembered as one of the great achievements in broadcast comedy. Her signature character, Aitaya, the charwoman, a humble cleaning woman in a headscarf and apron with a mop, was one of the most recognizable images in American popular culture for decades. When Burnett appeared as the charwoman at the end of each episode and tugged her ear, it was a private signal to her grandmother watching at home. A moment of personal warmth broadcast to millions. The character and the gesture had become synonymous with Burnett's name. In April of 2006, Family Guy aired an episode called Peterotica. In it, Peter Griffin visits an adult bookstore. Quagmire tells him, "The store is very clean because, as he puts it, Carol Burnett works there as a part-time janitor." The screen cuts to show Burnett's charwoman character, her signature look, her headscarf, her apron, mopping the floors of the pornography shop in front of adult novelty items while an altered version of the show's characteristic theme plays. As the scene ends, a character says that when Burnett tugged her ear at the end of her show, she was saying goodnight to her mother. Quagmire responds by wondering what she tugged to say goodnight to her father. A year later, in March of 2007, Carol Burnett filed a lawsuit. She sued 20th Century Fox, the show's production company, for $6 million. The lawsuit alleged copyright infringement, the unauthorized use of the charwoman character, and a violation of Burnett's right of publicity, which is the legal right of a person to control the commercial use of their image, name, and likeness. The complaint argued that the depiction in Family Guy had disparaged her and used her trademarked character without permission in a way that damaged her reputation. The lawsuit was significant for several reasons. First, Burnett was not a fringe figure making a marginal claim. She was one of the most respected comedians in American history, an institution, and her legal action carried moral weight that a complaint from a lesser-known figure might not have. Second, the lawsuit engaged directly with the legal question of what constitutes protected parody in American law. The First Amendment protects parody broadly. A court had to determine whether the Family Guy depiction was a legitimate parody, something that comments on the original work or its subject, or simply a use of a copyrighted character in a commercial context without permission, which would not receive First Amendment protection. In May of 2007, a U.S. district judge dismissed Burnett's suit. The ruling found that the depiction was protected by the First Amendment. The court acknowledged that the portrayal had placed Burnett's character in a demeaning context, and that the charwoman was more creative and original than anything Family Guy had produced on its own. But the ruling determined that in order to parody the charwoman character, the show had to invoke the character itself, which necessarily invoked Burnett, and that this was the nature of parody. It comments on the original by working with recognizable elements of it. The court found that the use fell within the protections of parody under American law. Burnett lost the case. The ruling didn't mean she had been wrong to file it, or that the show's use of her character was morally unambiguous. But legally, Family Guy had won, and the ruling added to the emerging body of case law defining what animated parody could do to real people and their associated images. Just a few months after the Burnett ruling, in October of 2007, the show faced a different kind of legal challenge from a different direction. The Bourne Company Music Publishers, the sole copyright holder of the song When You Wish Upon a Star, the Disney song from Pinocchio that is among the most recognizable pieces of American musical culture, filed suit against Fox and Seth MacFarlane. The complaint alleged copyright infringement based on the episode When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, in which Peter Griffin sings a song called I Need a Jew to a melody that closely resembles When You Wish Upon a Star. The lyrics of Peter's song leaned heavily into Jewish stereotypes, with Peter singing about his need for Jewish financial guidance, a premise the show framed as a satire of. the character's own ignorance rather than an endorsement of the stereotypes. Sample lyrics included lines about Hebrew people being adored, even though they killed my Lord. A line so pointed, it had been altered for television broadcast compared to the version that appeared on the DVD. The Bourne Company's legal argument was interesting because it tried to close the parody defense that had protected Family Guy in the Burnett case. Their argument was that the I Need a Jew number was not actually a parody of When You Wish Upon a Star in any meaningful sense, that it didn't comment on the original song or use the original as its subject. Instead, the Bourne Company argued, Family Guy had simply borrowed the melody of a famous song to give their own joke extra recognition, which was copyright infringement rather than parody. Parody legally requires that the new work comment on or critique the original work. Using a famous tune to make an unrelated joke might be a lot of things, but it isn't parody in the protected legal sense. The case went to court. In March of 2009, U.S. District Judge Deborah Batts ruled in favor of Family Guy. The judge found that the use of the melody did constitute parody because I Need a Jew used the association with When You Wish Upon a Star, a song about magical thinking and the fulfillment of wishes, to comment satirically on the wishful thinking involved in believing that hiring a Jewish person would solve all your financial problems. The song's entire premise, the judge concluded, depended on the ironic juxtaposition between the wish fulfillment innocence of the Disney original and the crude stereotyping of the parody. That juxtaposition was the joke, and making that joke required invoking the original. Case dismissed. 2 cases, 2 wins for Family Guy. But the Bourne case had generated significant additional coverage for a reason beyond the lawsuit itself. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein had its own separate history of controversy that predated the lawsuit by years. The episode had been produced in 2000 during the show's original run. Fox had reviewed it and declined to air it, citing concerns that the episode's Jewish stereotypes might be perceived as anti-Semitic, concerns that were not unfounded, given that the episode's entire premise involved Peter believing that Jewish people were intrinsically better with money than non-Jewish people. The episode was held back for 3 years, eventually premiering on Adult Swim in November of 2003, and then on Fox itself in December of 2004 with some content alterations, including the modification of the song's most pointed lyric. By the time the Bourne Company sued in 2007, the episode had been in circulation for 4 years, had generated its own ongoing debate about whether it was an incisive satire of stereotype-based thinking or an amplification of the very stereotypes it claimed to satirize. The question that both controversies circled without fully answering was the same question. What is the relationship between a joke and the thing it's joking about? If you make a joke that depends on a stereotype to function, are you commenting on that stereotype or reinforcing it? The show's consistent answer was that Peter Griffin was the joke, not the Jewish people he was stereotyping. That the comedy came from the character's idiocy, not from the stereotypes themselves. Whether that's a satisfying defense is a question that reasonable people can disagree about, and the ongoing coverage of these controversies reflected genuine disagreement about exactly that. Beyond the major lawsuits, Family Guy's use of real public figures generated a constant, low-level controversy that occasionally broke into significant news. Tom Cruise appeared in an episode in a way that many interpreted as an outing of his sexuality, with a cutaway showing him running from his gay thoughts. A 2003 episode featured a miniature version of President John F. Kennedy as a Pez dispenser with a bullet wound in his head from which candy popped. MacFarlane himself cited that sequence as one of the most offensive things the show had ever produced. An episode comparing the McCain-Palin campaign to the Nazi Party, featuring a campaign pin on a Nazi uniform, generated coverage during the 2008 election. The JFK Pez dispenser was eventually removed from streaming versions of the episode, quietly disappearing from the version available on Hulu and other platforms, making it one of the several pieces of Family Guy content that have been altered or removed from their original form in the years since broadcast. The show that aired in 1999 and the show that streams in 2025 are not identical. Content has been cut, altered, or restructured to account for changed standards, legal considerations, and platform requirements. The history of what's been changed is itself a document of where the lines moved. Section 7. Sarah Palin Down Syndrome and the Political Firestorm of 2010. On the night of February 14th, 2010, an episode of Family Guy aired on Fox that put the show in the center of one of the most politically charged media controversies of the year. The episode was called Extra Large Medium. The plot involved Peter developing what he believed were psychic powers, while Chris developed a crush on a classmate named Ellen. Ellen had Down syndrome, and Ellen, on a date with Chris, mentioned that her mother was the former governor of Alaska. Sarah Palin had been the 2008 Republican vice presidential nominee. She had resigned as Alaska's governor in July of 2009, and her youngest son, Trig, had Down syndrome. The implication in Ellen's single line of dialogue was obvious and unmistakable. The show had created a character with Down syndrome who identified herself as the daughter of Alaska's former governor. Every person watching understood what that meant. Bristol Palin, Sarah's daughter, responded first. On her mother's Facebook page, she published a statement addressed to Fox Hollywood. If the writers of a particularly pathetic cartoon show thought they were being clever in mocking my brother and my family yesterday, they failed. All they proved is that they're heartless jerks. The statement was widely shared and quickly picked up by news outlets. Sarah Palin then appeared on The O'Reilly Factor on Fox News, the same network that aired Family Guy, and called the people who made the show cruel, cold-hearted people who were adding to a culture of mockery of people with disabilities. When is enough enough? She asked. And when are we going to be willing to say, some things just aren't really funny? The irony of Palin criticizing a Fox show while appearing on Fox News was not lost on commentators. But the criticism itself was notable because of its specific framing. Palin wasn't objecting to the existence of a character with Down syndrome on the show. She was objecting to the implication that the character was a version of her son, and to the show using her son's disability as a vehicle for a political joke at her expense. The argument was that whatever you thought about Sarah Palin as a public figure, and Family Guy had clear views about what it thought, Trig was a child who had not chosen to be in the public eye, and using him as the material for a joke was a different category of action than satirizing his mother. Seth MacFarlane's response came through multiple channels. He appeared on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, where he said that Palin's complaints were an effort to obtain phony pity. He gave an interview to the Los Angeles Times in which he described the show as an equal opportunity offender that used biting satire as the basis of its humor. The writer's position was consistent with their general approach. The joke was not about Trig. The joke was about Sarah Palin, who was a political figure and therefore a fair target for satire. The character Ellen was not presented as a victim or as an object of ridicule for having Down syndrome. She was presented as a normal teenager, opinionated and confident, whose one reference to her parentage was designed as a political shot at Palin rather than anything about Down syndrome specifically. The most significant voice in the debate turned out to belong neither to Palin nor to MacFarlane. Andrea Faye Friedman was the actress who had voiced Ellen. She was 39 years old, and she herself had Down syndrome. She issued a statement to the New York Times that cut through the noise of the political argument with clarity and conviction. Former Governor Palin does not have a sense of humor. I thought the line, "I am the daughter of the former governor of Alaska," was very funny. She added that she was proud to have played the character and not embarrassed. She said she was making fun of Sarah Palin, but not her son. And in a line that became one of the most quoted responses in the entire controversy, she said, "My mother did not carry me around under her arm like a loaf of French bread the way former Governor Palin carries her son Trig around looking for sympathy and votes." That statement, from an actual person with Down syndrome who had performed in the episode under discussion, immediately complicated any reading of the controversy that framed the show as simply mocking the disabled. The actress who was being ostensibly defended by Palin's criticism had deliberately sought out the role, was proud of it, and thought the joke was funny and appropriate. Friedman had appeared on the television show Life Goes On and had a long career in film and television. Her public response to Palin's characterization of the episode as cruel was, in its way, more pointed than anything MacFarlane had said. Steve Callahan, who had written the episode, addressed Palin's criticism at San Diego Comic-Con in July of 2010, with a line that was either a perfect example of the show's approach or an illustration of its limitations, depending on your perspective. He said, "This season, I decided that I'd even things out and write something that would offend smart people." That comment was itself widely reported because it was either brilliantly self-aware or exhaustingly defensive, and the news coverage couldn't fully decide which. The episode received a 2010 Emmy nomination for Outstanding Original Music and Lyrics for the song Down Syndrome Girl, which Brian composed and performed in the episode as part of Chris's preparations for his date with Ellen. The nomination was another layer of complexity in the coverage. Here was an episode that had been publicly called cruel and cold-hearted by a former vice presidential nominee, simultaneously being recognized by the Television Academy for the quality of its musicianship. The Emmy nomination was covered widely as evidence that the artistic community had reached a different verdict on the episode than the Palins had. 6.4 million households watched the episode when it originally aired. It was a strong rating. The controversy had not hurt the show's numbers. If anything, and this was a pattern that repeated throughout the show's relationship with controversy, the media attention had probably drawn additional viewers to an episode they might not have otherwise sought out. The Palin controversy illustrated something about how Family Guy's news coverage worked at its most effective. The show's satirical targets were always public figures who had chosen public life and were, by any traditional standard, fair game for satire. But the comedy sometimes touched people adjacent to those targets. Family members, people with disabilities who became incidental to the joke, in ways that generated a genuine ethical complexity the show didn't always fully engage with. The PTC's objections were easy to dismiss because they were organized, ideological, and often legally unsophisticated. Palin's objection was harder to simply wave away, not because she was right about the show's intent, but because the person she was defending, Trig, genuinely hadn't signed up for any of it. The fact that Andrea Friedman's statement neutralized much of Palin's argument didn't eliminate the question the controversy raised about where the edges of political satire are. Section 8. The Marathon, the Conspiracy Theory, and the Episode That Disappeared Overnight. On the evening of March 17, 2013, an episode of Family Guy called Turban Cowboy aired on Fox. About 4 weeks later, on April 15, 2013, 2 bombs detonated near the finish line of the Boston Marathon. 3 people died. 264 people were injured. The city of Boston entered a state of shock and grief that rippled across the country. Within hours of the bombing, the fake clip appeared. Someone, and no one was ever definitively identified as its creator, had edited together 2 unrelated scenes from Turban Cowboy and uploaded the resulting video to the internet. The first clip showed Bob Costas asking Peter Griffin how he had won the Boston Marathon, followed by a cutaway showing Peter driving his car through the race, mowing down runners as he went. The second clip showed Peter dialing a cell phone that detonated a series of off-screen explosions. In the actual episode, these two scenes had no relationship to each other. They came from entirely different storylines within an episode that was already, by critical consensus, one of the weakest of the season. But edited together, placed end-to-end with nothing to establish their separate contexts, the clips appeared to show Peter Griffin committing the Boston Marathon bombing. The video was circulated by conspiracy theorist Alex Jones on his InfoWars website, with the implication, stated or at minimum strongly implied, that the clip showed either that the show had predicted the attack or, in the more extreme version of the claim, that the show's content had somehow inspired it. Neither suggestion had any basis in fact. Turban Cowboy had aired more than a month before the bombing. The car through the marathon gag had nothing to do with explosives in its original context. The editing was a deliberate fabrication designed to create a false connection between a piece of entertainment and a real act of terror. But the video spread rapidly on social media in the immediate aftermath of a bombing, when the public was hungry for information and when credulous sharing was at its highest. By the time fact-checkers and journalists had established the clip's falsity, it had been seen by millions of people. Some of them remained convinced the connection was real, even after being presented with the evidence otherwise. YouTube received enough flags in the video to mark it as potentially offensive and inappropriate, though the platform's automated systems struggled to fully control the spread of something that was going viral through social sharing. Fox moved within hours. The network pulled Turban Cowboy from Fox.com, from Amazon's streaming library, and from Hulu. A spokesperson confirmed that the episode had been removed and stated that the network had no immediate plans to broadcast it again. Seth MacFarlane issued a statement on Twitter. "The edited Family Guy clip currently circulating is abhorrent. The event was a crime and a tragedy, and my thoughts are with the victims." He also, in a separate communication, made clear his disgust at the people who had created the fake clip, noting that he considered the bombing a major tragedy and viewed any attempt to connect his show to it as deeply wrong. The coverage of this sequence of events was extensive. CNN, Reuters, Rolling Stone, Time, the Los Angeles Times, and dozens of other outlets reported on both the fake clip and Fox's decision to pull the episode. The story had the quality of a news cycle that kept generating new angles. First the bombing, then the viral clip, then the debunking, then Fox's response, then MacFarlane's statement, then the broader conversation about how conspiracy theories spread in the aftermath of traumatic events. It was a story about terrorism, about the internet, about cable news, and incidentally about a cartoon. The actual Turban Cowboy episode had its own separate pre-existing problems that the bombing controversy then layered over. The episode's central plot involved Peter befriending a Muslim man named Mahmoud after a skydiving accident, converting to Islam, and then discovering that Mahmoud was actually a terrorist planning to blow up a bridge. The episode had received a D grade from the AV Club upon its original airing, which described it as feeling like an episode made in 2002 and left on the shelf for a decade, completely unaware of just how uniformly Middle Eastern characters are depicted as terrorists. The critique was about the episode's casual acceptance of the most harmful and reductive stereotype applied to Muslim people in post-9/11 American culture, that the brown guy Peter befriends turns out to be plotting mass murder. The joke depended on an assumption that the audience would find the revelation of Mahmoud's terrorism surprising, when in fact the episode had set up his identity as a Muslim man with so many sinister undertones that the twist felt inevitable and the entire plot felt like a delivery mechanism for a bigoted assumption dressed up as satire. This critique existed independently of the bombing, and a version of it would have applied to the episode regardless of subsequent events. But after April 15th, 2013, Turban Cowboy became associated not just with a critically panned episode about Muslim terrorism, but with a genuine act of terrorism and a viral conspiracy theory that had drawn a direct, if false, connection between the show and the bodies at the Boston Marathon's finish line. The episode was not returned to Hulu until September of 2022, 9 years after the bombing. For almost a decade, it existed in a gray zone between the show's official archive and the disappeared episodes. Not as permanently banned as partial terms of endearment, but not accessible through normal channels either. It remains unavailable on many streaming platforms outside the United States. The aftermath of the Boston Marathon incident also generated a secondary discussion about the nature of comedy and responsibility in the context of real tragedy. The car through the marathon gag that had been part of the fake clip was, in its original context, exactly the kind of throwaway absurdist violence that Family Guy used constantly. Something so extreme and cartoonish that it was clearly not meant to be taken literally, lasting a few seconds, and designed to get a quick laugh before the story moved on. That same content in the wrong context at the wrong moment became something entirely different. The show had not changed. The events around it had, and that collision between a comedy's archive of extreme images and the real-world extreme events that occasionally aligned with them, created a category of problem that Family Guy would navigate repeatedly without ever fully resolving. Section 9. The Night Brian Died. A cartoon dog, 100,000 signatures, and a national conversation. There's a specific quality to the grief people feel about fictional characters when they die, and it's genuinely not the same as grief about real people. It's not smaller, exactly. It's different in a way that's hard to articulate, but important to acknowledge. Because what happened on November 24th, 2013, the night Family Guy's Brian Griffin was killed, generated a public response that confounded almost everyone who witnessed it, including the people who caused it. The episode was called Life of Brian. It was the 6th episode of the 12th season. Its plot began with Stewie destroying his time machine to prevent any further interference with history, then discovering that this decision had consequences he hadn't anticipated. The consequences were immediate and terrible. Brian, crossing the street with Stewie to retrieve a hockey net they'd found at a junkyard, was struck by a speeding car. He was rushed to the veterinary hospital. The family gathered around him, and then Brian Griffin, the talking dog who had been part of the Griffin family since the first episode in 1999, died. He told Stewie that he had had a wonderful life. He asked for the family to be told he was grateful, and then he was gone. The episode did not end there. It continued. A new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico of The Sopranos, was introduced. The family welcomed him. The Griffin household continued. Life in the fictional universe of the show went on without Brian. What happened on Twitter was immediate and enormous. The hashtag #RIPBrian reached the top of the trending lists within minutes of the episode ending on the East Coast. By the time it had aired on the West Coast, the hashtag was trending nationally. Fans, some genuinely grief-stricken, some furious, some confused, some all three simultaneously, flooded social media with reactions to a cartoon character's death. The intensity of the response was striking even by the standards of fan communities that were accustomed to passionate reactions to beloved shows. Brian Griffin had been a character for 14 years. He had been, for many viewers, the character they identified with most, the smart one, the literary one, the one who felt out of place and was trying to figure out where he belonged. He had been, in the show's own language, the heart of it. Within 24 hours, a petition had appeared on Change.org, calling on Seth MacFarlane and Fox to bring Brian back. The petition was started by a Family Guy fan named Aaron Thompson in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Within days, it had over 80,000 signatures. By the time it peaked, it had passed 100,000. The story was covered by CNN, TMZ, The Washington Post, Rolling Stone, The Independent, In the UK, the International Business Times, CBS News, and the Huffington Post, among dozens of others. A fictional dog's death had become national news. Alex Borstein, who voices Lois Griffin, gave an interview to BuzzFeed in which she described the reaction with something between bewilderment and astonishment. She said she had never experienced anything like the hate mail she was receiving on Twitter. Not just people expressing sadness, but people who were genuinely angry at her, personally, for a decision she had nothing to do with. How are human beings still functioning when the reaction that I've seen to a talking cartoon dog's death is, there's been more outrage than anything I've ever experienced in my life, she said. MacFarlane maintained a deliberate public silence for 3 weeks after the episode aired. He had been the voice of Brian for 14 years, and his silence was itself a kind of statement, or, as some fans interpreted it, a deliberate act of withholding that amplified the uncertainty about whether the death was permanent. Then, on December 15th, 2013, the episode Christmas Guy aired. In it, Stewie, using time travel equipment he had managed to repair, went back in time to save Brian from being hit by the car. Brian returned. The Griffin family was reunited. Everything was restored. 2 hours later, MacFarlane broke his silence on Twitter. He wrote, "And thus endeth our warm, fuzzy holiday lesson. Never take those you love for granted, for they can be gone in a flash." Then, a minute later, "I mean, you didn't really think we'd kill off Brian, did you? Jesus, we'd have to be effing high." The fan reaction to Brian's return was not uniformly relieved. Some viewers who had been genuinely moved by the death felt manipulated by the reversal. The consensus that emerged in the weeks and months after, both among fans and among critics who covered the show professionally, was that Brian's death had been a ratings stunt. The show had killed off a beloved character to generate attention, controversy, and viewership for the weeks surrounding the event, then brought him back to avoid any permanent consequences. This reading was supported by the executive producer Steve Callahan's original comments to E! Online when the episode aired, in which he said the idea had caught fire when it was pitched, and that Brian had been chosen as the character to kill partly because a dog's death was more believable than the death of one of the kids. MacFarlane, in a Reddit AMA and in interviews with reporters at the Television Critics Association, acknowledged that the size of the reaction had surprised him. "I was very surprised by the size of the reaction," he said. "To me, the positive spin was hey, people still really give a ST about this guy. That's cool." He said the intention had been to remind people this is still a show where anything can happen, to combat the perception that Family Guy had become predictable. What the entire Brian Griffin death saga demonstrated, more than anything, was the specific and unusual relationship that audiences had developed with Family Guy over 14 years. Brian was not a realistic character. He was a talking dog in a universe where a baby had built a time machine. And yet the response to his death, the trending hashtags, the 100,000 signature petition, the national news coverage, the hate mail flooding cast members' Twitter accounts, was the kind of response you would expect for the death of a character who felt real to people. Not fake real, but actually real in the way that people who matter to you are real. The coverage of Brian's death was the most sustained piece of Family Guy-related national news since the show's early battles with the FCC. But it was news of a completely different kind. There was no regulatory authority involved. There was no lawsuit. There was no foreign government banning the episode. There was just an enormous audience responding with authentic emotion to the death of a character they had watched for 14 years, and then responding with complex mixed feelings to the revelation that the death had never been intended to stick. Section 10. The 188,000 letters. Family Gay, the FCC, and what it took to generate a nation's outrage. The single episode of Family Guy that generated the most formal federal complaints in the show's history was not, as you might expect, an episode that touched on race or religion or disability. It was not the episode about Down syndrome. It was not the episode about marijuana legalization. It was Family Gay, which aired on March 8, 2009, and which centered on Peter Griffin temporarily becoming gay after being injected with a gene during a medical experiment. The Parents Television Council, which had been fighting Family Guy for almost a decade by that point, identified the episode as its highest priority target and launched what became its single most successful complaint campaign. They mobilized their entire membership. The result was 188,000 letters to the Federal Communications Commission. 188,000 individuals, or at minimum 188,000 letter submissions from PTC members and sympathizers, wrote to a federal agency to complain about a cartoon that aired at 9 o'clock on a Sunday night. To put that number in context, the FCC typically receives a few thousand complaints about any given piece of controversial television content. The PTC's campaign against Family Gay exceeded most previous records for a single scripted comedy episode. The organization's president, Tim Winter, issued a statement describing the episode in the kind of clinical language that contrasted memorably with the cartoon absurdism of the content being described. He said Fox had treated viewers to everything from an 11-way gay orgy to baby Stewie eating a bowl of cereal with horse sperm instead of milk, and described the main character fantasizing about his wife and moaning while a horse licks his bare behind. Presented in bureaucratic language, the PTC's descriptions of Family Guy episodes consistently had a quality of accidental absurdity. The episode itself was, from a plot perspective, relatively sympathetic in its treatment of gay characters. Peter's temporary homosexuality was played for laughs, but the love interest he developed while gay was presented as a real person with genuine feelings. And the episode didn't frame homosexuality as inherently ridiculous, so much as it used Peter's experience of it to explore the character's general obliviousness. The episode also included the graphic content the PTC was focused on. Because Family Guy always included graphic content as a matter of course, the FCC, having received 188,000 complaints, reviewed the episode, and then, consistent with its treatment of every previous Family Guy complaint, declined to take action. The agency determined that the episode's content, while explicit, did not meet the legal standard for actionable indecency. Fox was not fined. MacFarlane was not sanctioned. Family Guy continued to air. The episode's title itself had generated coverage before any FCC complaints were filed. Family Gay was a pun on the show's title, a reference to its own nature, and a provocation directed at anyone who would object to the subject matter. The naming convention was characteristically MacFarlane, the kind of wordplay that served as advance notice of what an episode was about and what the show thought of people who might object to it. The response from the gay rights community to the episode was genuinely mixed. GLAAD, the media advocacy organization that monitors and responds to LGBTQ representation in entertainment, had a complicated relationship with Family Guy throughout this period. The show had included gay characters and gay storylines since its early seasons, and it had generally framed homosexuality as a normal part of the world, rather than as something requiring special explanation. At the same time, many of the show's jokes about gay characters relied on broad stereotypes, and Stewie's sexuality, increasingly coded as gay through a series of increasingly explicit jokes across many seasons, was handled in ways that GLAAD periodically took issue with. The Family Gay controversy was a specific case study in the gap between the kind of cultural objections that the PTC raised and the kind that came from communities the show was depicting. For the PTC, the episode was objectionable because it contained explicit content and because it portrayed homosexuality in a context the organization found inappropriate. For LGBTQ critics of the episode, the objection was more nuanced. It was about whether the treatment of gay identity was actually affirming or whether it was using queerness as a punchline in ways that, however unintentionally, reinforced negative associations. Family Guy's history with LGBTQ representation generated coverage in entertainment media on a fairly regular basis throughout its run, precisely because the show existed in a complicated middle space, neither a hostile depiction of gay characters nor a particularly thoughtful or nuanced one, but something in between that resisted easy categorization and therefore kept being written about. Section 11, banned before it aired. The Weinstein episode, anti-Semitism accusations, and a 3-year delay. The story of When You Wish Upon a Weinstein begins in 1999 or 2000, depending on which production timeline you follow, and it ends, in its initial chapter, in December of 2004, when Fox finally broadcast a version of it that had been sitting in a drawer for 4 years. In between those dates, the episode went through a shelving, a DVD release, an Adult Swim premiere, a copyright lawsuit, and a sustained argument about whether it was anti-Semitic satire or just anti-Semitic. The episode's premise involved Peter Griffin praying for a Jewish person to help him manage his finances, following a belief rooted in the most basic negative stereotype about Jewish people and money. Peter meets a Jewish accountant named Max Weinstein, who helps him navigate a financial scam. Convinced that Jewish people are intrinsically better with money, Peter then decides to have his son, Chris, converted to Judaism so that Chris will benefit from this supposed advantage. Lois attempts to stop the bar mitzvah. The family has to escape an angry synagogue congregation. Nuns attack them on the way home. It's a Family Guy episode. The musical centerpiece of the episode was I Need a Jew, sung by Peter to the melody of When You Wish Upon a Star. The song's lyrics placed Peter's stereotyping of Jewish people in explicit rhyming form. Lines about Hebrew people being adored despite having killed my Lord were among the most pointed. The DVD version of the episode retained the line intact. Fox's broadcast version changed it to I don't think they killed my Lord, altering the joke but not the song's basic character. When Fox reviewed the completed episode, they decided not to air it. The concern, as articulated by the network, was that the episode's depictions of Jewish people and Judaism carried a real risk of being perceived as anti-Semitic. The show framed Peter's stereotyping as a reflection of his own stupidity rather than an expression of any actual belief. But the network worried that not every viewer would receive it with that framework intact, and that the explicit articulation of the stereotype in song form might cause genuine harm regardless of authorial intent. This decision was not announced publicly in 2000 when it was made. The episode was simply absent from the second season lineup, a gap in the production that went unexplained. It was only when the show's early seasons were released on DVD that the episode surfaced. The Volume 2 DVD set, released in September of 2003, included the episode. Cartoon Network's Adult Swim then aired it in November of 2003, filling one of the broadcast gaps left by Fox's original decision. Fox itself finally aired a version of the episode in December of 2004, after the show had already returned from cancellation with its 4th season. By the time the episode eventually aired on Fox, it had been in circulation for over a year through DVD and Adult Swim, and the controversy it had initially prompted had somewhat settled. Viewers who saw the episode in the context of the full Fox broadcast generally found it less offensive than feared, or at least found it no more offensive than a typical Family Guy episode. The critical consensus was that the episode's satire was aimed at Peter's ignorance, rather than at Jewish people themselves, and that the show's treatment of the Jewish characters and of Judaism as a religion and culture was more respectful than the premise might have suggested. But the episode remained a reference point in ongoing discussions about Family Guy's relationship with racial and ethnic humor. In 2014, an Israeli newspaper published an analysis of a different episode, 3 Acts of God, arguing that a scene in the episode was evidence of long-held anti-Semitism by McFarlane. An Australian Jewish studies columnist wrote a piece in the same period, arguing that several Family Guy episodes had ridiculed Jews and reinforced anti-Semitic stereotypes. These critiques did not generate the same level of national news coverage as the PTC battles or the Boston Marathon controversy, but they accumulated into a body of critical literature that complicated any simple reading of the show's relationship with ethnic and religious humor. McFarlane's consistent response was that Family Guy was an equal opportunity offender, that every religious group, every ethnicity, every nationality received the same irreverent treatment, and that singling out any particular episode or joke as evidence of specific bias required ignoring the show's overall pattern. Whether that defense is convincing depends partly on whether you believe that applying equal irreverence to all groups produces equal outcomes, or whether some groups are more vulnerable to harm from certain kinds of jokes than others. That debate, which has no clean resolution, has followed Family Guy throughout its run and continues to generate academic papers, think pieces, and occasional news coverage whenever a specific episode catches the attention of a critic or an advocacy organization. Section 12. The Simpsons crossover, the rape joke, and the moment that defined a debate. In September of 2014, Family Guy did something that television insiders have been predicting for years and fans have been fantasizing about for decades. The show crossed over with The Simpsons. The Griffins went to Springfield. The two most iconic animated families in American television history shared the same episode for the first time. The crossover event was called The Simpsons Guy, and it was a genuine ratings event. One of the most watched episodes of either show in years, pulled off with evident affection and skill from the writers of both programs. The episode also generated one of the most significant controversies in the show's history, and it happened before the episode even aired. The trailer for The Simpsons Guy contained a scene in which Bart Simpson teaches Stewie Griffin how to make prank phone calls. Bart calls the bar and asks for a fictional person with an innuendo name, the classic Simpsons gag, decades old and beloved. Then Stewie makes his own call, and Stewie tells the bartender that his sister is being raped. The joke was visible in the trailer that Fox released to promote the episode, which meant that the controversy began before the first viewer had watched a complete episode. Tim Winter, the president of the Parents Television Council, wrote formal letters to Seth MacFarlane, to Simpsons creator Matt Groening, and to Fox. He said that the rape joke made rape less outrageous in real life, and argued that children who watch The Simpsons but not Family Guy would encounter Family Guy's brand of humor without the context that regular Family Guy viewers had. The implication was that the crossover created a specific problem. It brought Family Guy's sensibility into a context where it would reach an audience that hadn't opted into it. A spokeswoman from RAINN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, the largest anti-sexual assault organization in the United States, offered a more nuanced reading. She said that the show appeared to be making it clear that rape is not funny by how they are positioning the joke, meaning that the joke's target was Stewie's inappropriateness, not the act of rape itself. MacFarlane, in an interview with Entertainment Weekly, said the joke was pretty funny in context and acknowledged that he would be attacked for saying it, but maintained the position anyway. The crossover had generated enormous coverage for multiple reasons beyond the rape joke. The sheer event of seeing Peter Griffin and Homer Simpson in the same episode was remarkable. Two characters who occupied very similar cultural spaces but had never formally coexisted. The episode also included a trial in which Peter and Homer's respective beer brands competed in a legal proceeding, and a fight between Brian and Santa's little helper, the Simpsons' dog, that ran for an extended and visually impressive sequence. By almost any measure, the crossover was a creative and commercial success. And it was also, in the weeks before it aired, a news story principally because of a 3-second joke in its trailer. The rape joke controversy reflected a tension that had been building in public discourse about comedy for years, and that was in 2014 at something close to its peak. A broad cultural conversation about rape culture, about the relationship between humor and normalization, about who gets to decide when something is funny and who gets to decide when it causes harm, had been ongoing for years. Daniel Tosh's 2012 stand-up incident, in which he made a joke about a woman in his audience being raped, had been a flashpoint. The conversation had spread to television comedy, to internet comedy, to animated comedy. Family Guy's long history of rape-adjacent jokes, jokes that referenced sexual assault as the subject of a prank call, as the punchline of a cutaway gag, as the backstory of a minor character, had previously generated some criticism but had not become a major sustained news story in the way the crossover trailer joke did. The crossover brought the issue to a new scale because of its context. A rape joke in a regular Family Guy episode might be covered by entertainment critics and advocacy organizations. A rape joke in the trailer for the most anticipated animated television event in years was in front of a much larger audience, many of whom would have encountered it before having any choice about whether to engage with Family Guy's comedy. The PTC's argument about the show's reach into audiences who hadn't opted in had a specific force in this context that it often lacked in discussions about regular episodes. Section 13. Seth MacFarlane and the Plane. He Didn't Take This Section is about something that never actually became a Family Guy controversy in the strict sense, but that shaped everything around the show in ways that are essential to understanding the relationship between the man who created it and the headlines it generated. It's about September 11th, 2001. Seth MacFarlane had been up late the night of September 10th. He had given a lecture at his alma mater, the Rhode Island School of Design, and had gone out afterwards with faculty members and had a few drinks. He was exhausted and slightly hungover when he went to Boston's Logan International Airport the next morning to catch his flight back to Los Angeles. His travel agent had made an error on his itinerary. The agent had written the departure time as 8:15 in the morning rather than the correct 7:45. MacFarlane arrived at the counter 10 minutes after the gate had closed. The gate agent told him he was too late. He went to the lounge, sat down, and fell asleep. He woke 45 minutes later to a commotion. The television in the lounge was showing news coverage of a plane striking the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The flight number was announced. MacFarlane turned to the person next to him and said he had been supposed to be on that flight. He had missed his own death by 10 minutes. The flight was American Airlines Flight 11, the first plane to hit the World Trade Center. It carried 92 people, including crew, all of whom died. Seth MacFarlane, the creator of Family Guy, had been booked on it. His travel agent's mistake and his own hangover had kept him alive. MacFarlane has told the story in interviews several times over the years, on Piers Morgan's show, on The Howard Stern Show, in print. He describes the moment of realization with the specific quality of stillness that people often describe after close calls with mortality. A clarity that comes when your brain has to integrate the information that you almost ceased to exist. "My God," he told the person next to him in the lounge, "that was the flight I was supposed to be on. I was late. I missed it." The 9/11 near miss is not a Family Guy controversy. It's not an episode that made the news, a lawsuit, a ban. But it's part of the story of Family Guy's relationship with the news because it's part of the story of who Seth MacFarlane is and what he's been building since 1999. The show that had been canceled twice and survived both cancellations was being made by a man who had literally survived something far more absolute than cancellation. The irreverence that defined Family Guy's relationship with authority, with tragedy, with the question of what was allowed to be funny came from somewhere. Whether that somewhere was the near miss on Flight 11, or just the general sensibility of a person who thought nothing should be unsayable, it was real. And it shaped everything the show became. When Family Guy made jokes about death, about violence, about disasters, about the gap between tragedy and comedy, And it made those jokes constantly from its earliest episodes, with a commitment that sometimes crossed into territory that generated genuine controversy. Those jokes came from a show made by a person who had stood in an airport lounge and watched the plane he was supposed to be on disappear into a building. Whatever you believe about the ethics of dark comedy, that biographical fact lends the show's relationship with darkness a specific weight that pure analysis of content misses. Section 14. The Quagmire Problem. Grooming jokes, the Herbert character, and controversy that never fully landed. One of the most peculiar aspects of Family Guy's long relationship with controversy is the content that did not generate significant news coverage, even when it arguably should have. While the show fought wars with the FCC over gay orgies and horse sperm, and while it generated 100,000 signature petitions over a cartoon dog's death, it spent many seasons featuring a recurring character named Herbert, who was, by any straightforward reading, a pedophile. Herbert, the perverted old man, appeared throughout the show from the 4th season onward. He was elderly, had a tremulous voice, and had an openly expressed attraction to Chris Griffin, who was a teenage boy. The character's entire premise was built on the joke that an old man was sexually attracted to a child. The show played this for laughs. Herbert's advances were always ineffective, always rebuffed by Chris's obliviousness, and the comedy relied on the audience finding the character's desire either funny or disgusting or both. The Parents Television Council did include Herbert-related content in some of their FCC complaints. Critics occasionally wrote about the character as emblematic of the show's taste problems. But Herbert never became a national news story in the way that Brian's death or the abortion episode did. This absence tells you something about how Family Guy's controversies worked. The controversies that made significant news were almost always the ones that connected to an external event or a specific organized response. The PTC generated news through mass complaint campaigns. Sarah Palin generated news because she was a nationally known political figure with a large platform. Brian's death generated news because the audience's emotional response was so intense it became its own story. Herbert didn't generate news of the same magnitude, partly because no one organized a sustained campaign specifically about the character, and partly because the joke's premises, however uncomfortable, were not the kind that triggered the specific alarms of media watchdogs in the same way that explicit sexual content or political offense did. The Quagmire character generated similar dynamics. Glenn Quagmire was established from the earliest episodes as a sexual predator whose conquests were framed as comedy. His behavior included everything from a standard promiscuity to episodes that had him drugging women's drinks, which the show presented as an extreme expression of his character, rather than as an actual depiction of assault. Critics who examined the show's treatment of gender over the years consistently identified Quagmire's characterization as one of the most troubling elements of the show's moral universe. Not because the show endorsed his behavior, but because it consistently treated that behavior as funny rather than as cause for consequence. The PTC filed specific complaints about Quagmire-related content on multiple occasions. One complaint targeted the episode Quagmire's Mom, which included sexually explicit dialogue and jokes about statutory rape, including a scene in which Quagmire had sex with an underage girl and discovered her age only afterwards. The FCC reviewed the complaint and, consistent with its treatment of all previous Family Guy complaints, declined to take action. The Quagmire's Dad episode of 2010 generated its own specific controversy, in that case about transgender representation. The episode, which revealed that Quagmire's father had undergone gender reassignment surgery and was now a woman named Ida, generated significant criticism from LGBTQ advocacy groups for the treatment of the transgender character. Brian discovers he has been attracted to Ida before learning she is transgender, and his reaction, which involves vomiting at length, was widely criticized as transmisogynist, treating Ida's identity as something disgusting. GLAAD criticized the episode. Coverage in LGBTQ-focused media was extensive and negative. The episode remains one of the most criticized in the show's history from that community's perspective. Section 15, The Political Machine. How Family Guy made enemies on both sides. For a show that had a clearly liberal political sensibility, in the form of Brian's atheism, his advocacy for progressive causes, and the show's consistent mockery of Fox News, Family Guy managed to generate controversy from the political left with roughly the same regularity as from the right. This is partly because the show's approach to political commentary was genuinely irreverent, rather than simply partisan. It mocked everyone, and everyone's response was to find the mockery of everyone else funny and the mockery of their own position offensive. The most sustained political controversy from the left side of the spectrum came from the show's treatment of specific communities and identities. The Meg abuse storyline, which ran for roughly 10 seasons and involved the entire Griffin family treating their daughter with sustained cruelty, generated a specific kind of critical writing that identified the show's treatment of a female teenager as reflecting something troubling about the show's relationship with women in general. The pattern was that Meg existed primarily to be abused. Her appearance was mocked, her attempts at social connection were thwarted, her family members regularly expressed a wish that she didn't exist, and the abuse was framed as comedy without any of the moral weight that would typically attach to that treatment in another context. The most widely discussed single moment in Meg's storyline was the season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party, which had been written specifically to address the Meg abuse directly. The episode had Meg finally confront her family about their treatment of her. Her speech to Peter, laying out in specific terms how terrible he had been as a father, with reference to specific incidents from previous seasons, was praised by critics as one of the most honest pieces of writing the show had done about itself. It acknowledged, through Meg's voice, that the pattern of abuse was real and wrong and damaging. And then the episode's resolution had Meg accept her role as the family's punching bag, because without her absorbing everyone's frustrations, the family dynamic collapsed. She chose to return to being abused in order to maintain the equilibrium that everyone else depended on. The critical response to this choice was extensive and negative. The argument was that the episode had raised a genuine moral question about the show's treatment of a female character, given that character a moment of clarity and agency, and then concluded that the correct answer was for the abused person to accept their abuse for the greater good of the people doing the abusing. This criticism generated coverage in media that would not typically have been writing about Family Guy: feminist blogs, women's interest publications, academic writing about gender and television comedy. The Seahorse Seashell Party episode became a case study in discussions about how television comedy handled domestic abuse, whether framed as comedy or not, and what the difference was between acknowledging a dark thing and endorsing it. The show's relationship with race generated its own set of controversies that were regularly noted in coverage. Multiple episodes included racial humor that generated complaints from various advocacy groups. An episode in which Peter discovered he had black ancestry and in which played his discovery for comedy Yahweh in ways that relied on racial stereotypes about Black American culture was one example. Coverage of these moments in Black media and in publications focused on racial justice described a pattern of the show using minority identities as material while declining to explore those identities with any depth or complexity. MacFarlane's consistent response, equal opportunity offense, satire of ignorance rather than expression of it, was not universally convincing. The question of whether a joke about a racial stereotype makes fun of the person who holds the stereotype or amplifies the stereotype itself is genuinely complex. and the show's consistent framing of itself as satirizing stupidity rather than endorsing it left room for significant disagreement about whether that's what was actually happening. Section 16, the writer's strike, Fox's betrayal, and the political wars behind the scenes. The controversies that made Family Guy's news coverage were not all about the show's content. Some of them were about the show's production, about its relationship with Fox, and about the specific dynamics between Seth MacFarlane and the network that made him a household name, and then, over time, became a source of genuine public tension. The first significant backstage controversy came during the Writers Guild of America strike of 2007 and 2008. MacFarlane was a strong supporter of the writers' strike, which was called over residuals from DVD sales and digital distribution, the same economic model that had made Family Guy's revival possible in the first place. He joined the picket lines. He was, by all accounts, genuinely committed to the writers' cause rather than simply making a political gesture. During the strike, Fox made the decision to air 3 episodes of Family Guy that had already been completed, without MacFarlane's permission. The episodes had been produced before the strike began, which gave Fox the technical right to broadcast them. But airing them over the objections of the show's creator during an active labor dispute was a deliberate choice that said something about the relationship between the network and the person who had made them one of their biggest successes. MacFarlane was reported to be furious. The decision became a reference point in discussions about the creative autonomy that showrunners and creators had in the network television system. MacFarlane's frustration with Fox deepened over the years. In 2021, he posted on social media that Tucker Carlson's commentary on Fox News made him wish Family Guy was on any other network. He compared the relationship to a failing marriage, saying both parties knew it was not working. This was not a private communication. It was a public statement from the creator of one of Fox's most lucrative properties, posted to a social media platform where it was immediately picked up by entertainment and political journalists. The coverage noted the specific irony that Family Guy had spent years mocking Fox News through Brian Griffin's character, with Brian calling the network evil in one episode and accusing it of spreading fake news, while the show itself continued to air on Fox and contribute to the parent company's revenue. In 2020, MacFarlane signed a massive deal with NBC Universal, reportedly worth around $200 million over 5 years. The deal moved his production company away from the Fox ecosystem. The Orville, his science fiction show, moved from Fox to Hulu. Ted, his live-action prequel series, was produced for Peacock. MacFarlane was building his future at other companies, while Family Guy, contractually obligated to Fox, continued to generate income for the network he had publicly said he didn't want to be associated with. The 2023 WGA strike repeated the pattern of 2007. MacFarlane walked the picket line again. He and his showrunners made clear they would not work while the strike was ongoing. Production on Family Guy halted. The strike ended after months of negotiation and production resumed. But the disruption to an already aging show's creative momentum was another data point in the story of Family Guy's gradual disconnection from the passionate creation that had characterized its early years. In April of 2024, MacFarlane gave an interview in which he described the show's continued existence in terms that revealed how far it had traveled from the show that 15-minute pilot had promised. He said there was no good reason to stop making it because people still liked it. He said it helped fund causes he cared about, environmental conservation, the Rainforest Trust. He said the show had reached escape velocity, a point where it continued generating its own momentum regardless of any individual decision about whether to keep going. He framed the show's existence in terms of financial utility and a charitable purpose. He did not talk about exciting new stories he wanted to tell. He did not talk about characters he was still discovering. He talked about a franchise that existed and continued to generate enough value to justify its continuation. That April 2025 brought the announcement of a four-season renewal, a mega deal with parent company Disney that extended the show through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season, which would coincide with the show's 30th anniversary. 15 episodes per season. The show that debuted to 22 million viewers, that had been canceled and revived twice, that had generated more than 1 million individual FCC complaints, that had been sued by Carol Burnett, banned in Venezuela, and mourned by 100,000 petition signers when its talking dog died. That show was going to keep going until 2029, when it would turn 30 years old. Section 17. The Road to Germany. Holocaust comedy and the lines. Family Guy drew for itself. Not every Family Guy news story was about what the show crossed. Some were about what it didn't cross, or at least tried not to. And some of the most interesting coverage was about the episodes that walked very close to lines that even Family Guy's most committed defenders acknowledged were real. Road to Germany aired in season 7. It was like all the Road to episodes, a Brian and Stewie adventure built around travel, time, and their specific dynamic as companions. This one sent them back to Nazi Germany, specifically to 1939 Warsaw, where Mort Goldman had accidentally traveled using Stewie's time machine. The episode required the characters to move through Nazi-occupied Europe, and it was, by any measure, a formally ambitious piece of animation that took genuine risks with its subject matter. The episode generated significant coverage because it included visual imagery and comedic scenarios set in the specific context of the Holocaust. Characters moved through Nazi checkpoints. Jewish characters were in situations of genuine danger. The humor existed alongside subject matter that was, without question, among the most terrible events of the 20th century. A shot in the episode involved a Nazi uniform with a campaign button that read McCain-Palin, prompting Stewie to comment, "Huh, that's weird." A political joke that generated its own wave of coverage during the 2008 election. Critics who covered the episode noted that comparing the Republican presidential ticket to Nazism was a significant escalation even for a show that had been escalating provocations for years. Coverage of the episode was genuinely divided. Some critics found it to be a successful example of dark comedy engaging seriously with historical horror. Others found it inappropriate in ways that even Family Guy's typical shock comedy it didn't justify. The Holocaust is not a subject that invites the same treatment as all other historical events, and a recurring argument in the coverage was about whether the equal opportunity offender philosophy that McFarlane consistently invoked was actually appropriate when applied to one of humanity's most documented atrocities. The episode never generated an FCC complaint campaign comparable to Family Gay. It was not pulled from streaming. It remained in the show's official archive. But the conversation it generated among critics and viewers was one of the most substantive that Family Guy's content had produced. A genuine debate about the ethics of comedy in relation to historical tragedy that went beyond the standard battles between the show and its institutional critics. Section 18. The Kennedy Pez Dispenser, the YouTube game, and the Quiet Alterations. There is a version of Family Guy that no longer exists in publicly accessible form. Not the episodes that were officially banned or deliberately withheld, the partial terms of endearments and turban cowboys, but the quieter alterations, the content that was removed from streaming versions years after original broadcast. Sometimes with acknowledgement and sometimes without. The most notable example is the JFK Pez dispenser scene. In an early episode, the show included a cutaway of a Pez dispenser modeled on President John F. Kennedy. The dispenser dispensed candy through a bullet wound in Kennedy's head. Seth MacFarlane cited this scene himself, years later, as one of the most offensive things the show had ever produced. The scene was eventually removed from the streaming versions of the episode. If you watch it on Hulu today, it's not there. If you have the original DVD, it is. The original broadcast record of the scene exists, but it's not something you can pull up through normal streaming channels. This quiet, unannounced alteration of archived content happened with several pieces of Family Guy content across its run. YouTube's automated content ID system generated its own controversy when an episode used footage from a 7-year-old YouTube video displaying a glitch in the NES game Double Dribble. When Family Guy included the footage in an episode, YouTube's automated system flagged the original video and had it removed for apparent copyright infringement, even though the video predated Family Guy's use of it by 7 years. The outcry from the YouTube community was significant. Fox eventually issued an apology, and the original video was reinstated. The incident illustrated the unintended consequences of copyright enforcement systems that couldn't distinguish between a show reusing someone else's content and the original creator of that content. The relationship between Family Guy's archive and the contemporary streaming landscape is complicated. The show produced in 1999 and the show available in 2025 on streaming platforms are not identical. Content has been cut, modified, or removed from streaming versions for a variety of reasons. Rights clearances, change standards, advertiser requirements, and occasionally simple decisions by someone at Disney or Hulu that a particular piece of content no longer fits the platform's requirements. Family Guy's history is partially preserved and partially obscured, distributed across DVD sets, streaming libraries, and the cultural memory of viewers who saw things that no longer exist in the same form anywhere. Section 19. The Legacy, the Headlines, and Why the Story Isn't Over. Family Guy is going to turn 30 in 2029. In the years between its premiere and that anniversary, it will have generated more news coverage than almost any other entertainment product in American broadcast history that didn't involve a real-world scandal at the creative level. The controversies that attached themselves to the show were almost never about the people who made it behaving badly in their private lives. They were about the content itself, about what the show chose to say, and to whom, and in what context. The relationship between Family Guy and the news represents something larger than any individual controversy. It represents an ongoing negotiation about what comedy is allowed to do in a democratic society with a free press, a regulatory apparatus, and an advertising-dependent broadcast industry. Every time the show generated a news story, that story was an iteration of a fundamental question. What are the limits of expression, and who gets to decide? The FCC asked that question repeatedly, answered consistently that the show's content did not meet the legal standard for actionable indecency. The courts asked whether Carol Burnett's Charwoman could be placed in a pornography store and whether When You Wish Upon a Star could be parodied with anti-Semitic undertones, answered that the First Amendment protected both. Fox asked whether it would broadcast an episode in which a female character had an abortion, answered that it would not because of law, but because of economics. Venezuela asked whether the show could be broadcast in its territory, said no. 188,000 people asked whether they objected to what they had seen on their television screens on March 8, 2009, said yes in writing to a federal agency. The sum of these answers is not a clear or unified position. It's a contradiction. A show that was too offensive to broadcast in Venezuela and yet too protected by the First Amendment to be touched by American federal regulators. Too provocative for Fox's advertising department to risk airing in one specific case and yet profitable enough to be renewed through its 30th anniversary. The show exists in the spaces between these contradictions, and the news coverage it generated is the documentation of every time the contradictions became impossible to ignore. What makes Family Guy's story genuinely compelling, beyond the individual scandals and the specific controversies, is the way it illuminates the specific tensions in American culture during the period it covered. A show that debuted in 1999 and will continue into 2029 has watched the country change enormously. Through the September 11th attacks that almost took its creator's life, through the internet's transformation of what content meant and how it spread, through the social media era that turned a cartoon dog's death into a national conversation, through the political polarization that made an abortion episode impossible to broadcast. The controversies Family Guy generated were not random. They mapped, pretty accurately, onto the fault lines in American society at any given moment. The things people were fighting about, the lines people were drawing, the subjects nobody wanted to touch. Seth MacFarlane's show touched all of them. Not always wisely, not always well. Not always in ways that held up to serious scrutiny or justified their own provocations, but consistently, reliably, and with a kind of unself-conscious enthusiasm that made the provocations feel less like calculated stunts and more like genuine expressions of what the show believed about comedy's obligations. The last word in Family Guy's relationship with the news doesn't belong to the FCC, or to Fox, or to the PTC, which eventually went bankrupt, or to Sarah Palin, who appeared on the same network's news channel, to condemn the show that its entertainment division had broadcast. It belongs to the audience, the millions of people who watched the show in its prime, who circulated its best moments across the early internet, who signed petitions to bring back Brian Griffin, who stood in line at San Diego Comic-Con to hear Seth MacFarlane take questions. That audience's relationship with Family Guy was the original source of every controversy the show generated, because without the audience's investment, none of the provocations would have mattered enough to fight about. A show that nobody watched could say anything it wanted. The show that people fought over for decades was the show that people loved. And the fights, in the end, were evidence of the love. Section 20, Final Thoughts. The show that wouldn't stop? There's something almost meditative about sitting with all of this at once. Every lawsuit, every ban, every FCC complaint, every trending hashtag, every newspaper editorial, every petition and counter-petition and formal indecency proceeding and international incident. Laid out in sequence, the story of Family Guy's relationship with the news is not the story of a reckless show careening through controversy without purpose. It's the story of a specific kind of cultural artifact, one that occupied the exact intersection of entertainment and offense that American society has always found simultaneously irresistible and intolerable. The show that Seth MacFarlane pitched from a 7-minute hand-drawn pilot in 1998 became something he himself couldn't fully control. Not because Fox or Disney took it away from him, but because culture moves faster than any creator can steer it. The characters evolved in ways that generated new controversies. The internet created new ways for the show's content to circulate and be repurposed. The political climate shifted, making subjects that were once merely edgy feel genuinely dangerous, and making subjects that once felt dangerous feel merely edgy. Through all of it, the show kept generating headlines. In April 2025, Family Guy was renewed through its 30th anniversary. 15 episodes per season, 4 more seasons, carrying the Griffin family into a decade that would have seemed impossible to predict from that Super Bowl Sunday premiere in January of 1999. The show that came back from the dead in 2005 to produce more content, more controversies, more lawsuits and petitions, and FCC complaints and international bans, that show is still going. It will still be going when it turns 30. That fact is either a triumph or a cautionary tale depending on what you value most. If you value the early seasons, the sharp writing, the character warmth, the specific genius of a show that was doing something genuinely new, then the continuation is complicated, because the show that airs today is a very different thing from what premiered at Naramai in 1999. But if you value the show as a cultural institution, as a document of 30 years of American media and politics and comedy and controversy, then the continuation is exactly right. A show this embedded in the national conversation doesn't end. It just keeps going, generating new stories, new controversies, new versions of the same fundamental argument about what comedy is allowed to do. Whether you're just drifting off to sleep or you've been with us for the past 2 hours, thank you for spending the time with this story. If you found something in here that surprised you, a controversy you hadn't heard about, a lawsuit you didn't know the details of, a piece of the show's history that changed how you thought about something you'd watched, drop it in the comments. I read them. I'd genuinely like to know what landed. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of television's most turbulent histories, please subscribe to Uncle Guy Lore. This is the kind of storytelling we do here. Slow, thorough, the kind that takes the time the subject deserves. There's a lot more coming, more shows, more histories, more long nights worth of material. We'll see you in the next one. Stay comfortable, sleep well,